Judges chapter 19, hear the word of the Lord. In those days when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah, and his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and they drank, and they spent the night there. And on the 4th day, they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the two of them sat, and they ate and they drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him until he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day, he arose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart, and waited till the day declines." And so they ate, both of them. And when the man and the concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold, now the day has waned toward the evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here, and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall rise early in the morning for your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose and departed and arrived opposite Gibeah, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Gibeah, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." And he said to his young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah." So they pressed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning at Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjamites. And he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going? And where do you come from?" And he said to them, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote part of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to the house of the Lord. But no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant, and the young man and your servants. There's no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Peace be to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into the house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door, and they said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him, and so they seized the concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the evening. And as the day dawned to break, they let her go. And as the morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the door of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. And then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his house. And when he entered his house, he took a knife And taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Are we in decline? The modern opinion is that everything is improving. Just like computers, cell phones, cars, TVs, medicine has improved. And so now, all that is, it's better than it was 10 or 20, 50 years ago. So many people assume that, morals, culture, society has improved. All those things have gotten just better, just kind of evolved. This modern feeling is what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. The assumption that anything today is better than anything yesterday. That there's a kind of social Darwinism in which the best ideas thrive and so are adopted, and so that we've evolved into just morally superior people even without having to think about it. We just kind of get better naturally. Lewis, of course, did not agree. Neither did Russian-American sociologist Pitirim Sorokin, who described how societies degenerate and collapse. He said living societies, what he called super systems, start as, if they're healthy, they start as ideational. The ideational super system is, he said, quote, "a unified system of culture based upon the principle of a supersensory," means above our senses, beyond our senses, supersensory and super-rational God as the only true reality and value. That's the ideational. God is the truth. What he says is right, and societies that live according to that are ideational, and they're the ideal, he said. For Sorokin, the ideational was the pinnacle of civilization because it reached for aspirations beyond the mere satisfying of individual human desires. The ideational, he says, cultures like that, super systems, they tend to break down as they are compromised over time with humanistic demands. For example, something like marriage and divorce. You start with the ideational goal of following Jesus' commands. No divorce except for adultery. Maybe abandonment if you assume the abandoning spouse has committed adultery. And of course, the law punishes adultery. But that's the ideational goal. In other words, that marriage is not necessarily about your own happiness. It's about obeying God. It's about your holiness. But it begins to break down. Then you compromise a little because life is complicated and people demand more laxity. And so there are more reasons allowed over time for divorce. And eventually we have no-fault divorce with widespread cohabitation. And then with chronological snobbery, you congratulate yourself for having created a more humane culture. Never mind that child suicide rates have skyrocketed, like we talked about last week, because it turns out that these divorces of convenience, this instability, and the disintegrated families that they create are horrible for children. And that last phase, what culture degenerates into, is what Sorokin called the sensate. The culture that believes that true reality and value is sensory. It's what you can see and hold and hear and taste. In the sensate culture, the chief end of man is to enjoy himself for as long as he can. Whatever helps him enjoy himself is good. What I can feel is the only true reality and value. Now, of course, that's where we've arrived. We're living in a sensate culture that assumes that my happiness is found in the senses and what I feel. I feel happy in this, whatever this is. It's in my urges, whether bodily urges or psychological urges. If I feel I need to do that, whatever it is, then I can do it. If I feel I am that, then nothing can say otherwise. My feelings reign. Unless, of course, the one exception, if it conflicts with someone else's rights and feelings. If it gives you pleasure, then it's good, unless it hurts someone else. And then it gets a little complicated for them. So no amount of reasoning with the sensate, no amount of truth, of facts, of science, or anything, can counter the sensate. You can't argue that what you say you feel like doing, that is unnatural. We can tell from biology, we can tell from anatomy, we can tell that that's unnatural. They'll just say, well, I feel like doing it. And that trumps everything else. You can't argue that what you claim you are is false. Your feelings must be wrong. You claim you're a man. You claim to be a woman. We can tell reality says that you're a man. And they would just say, well, I feel like a woman. And for them, the ultimate reality in this sensate culture is their feelings. And there's no reasoning with that, because you can't reason about their feelings. The greatest value for them is satisfying those feelings. The question isn't whether we're declining. Of course we have. The question is what comes after this. How low can we go until things fall apart in a sensate culture? The sinner cannot hold because there is no sinner. Everyone is centered on their own feelings. What you feel may be different from what I feel. Well, what comes next after this? Chaos? Mere anarchy loosed upon the land? Dictatorship? Or revival? A great awakening? Well, here at the end of Judges, we see how low we can go. We see it in three major parts, one per chapter. First, in chapter 19, the perversity. Second, in chapter 20, the catastrophe. And third, in chapter 21, the quandary. In those days when there was no king in Israel, there was perversity. How low can they go? Well, they'll go as low as the city in Genesis 19. We're in Judges 19 here, but they'll go as low as the city in Genesis 19, whose sin, God said, was very grave. The city that became a byword for perversity. We found that out because of what happens to a Levite and his concubine. The Levite originally lives in Ephraim, north central Israel, just north of Benjamin, and his concubine, sort of a second-class wife. She was from, verse 2 says the concubine was unfaithful to him, probably unfaithful by doing what she does next, which is run away. She runs away back home to her father's house, and she was there for 4 months by the time the Levite came to fetch her to speak kindly to her. In verse 3, literally means to speak to her heart, to woo her back. And notice, by the way, that he is capable of speaking kindly when it's to his advantage. Then for verses 3 to 9, we're given this extensive description. Sometimes you would read the Bible, you spend so much time on things that we would not think we should spend time on. This extensive description of how hospitable and generous her father is. Just repeatedly urging the Levite to stay another day, eat together, chill. The first one is, take a morsel of bread and relax in the morning. This morsel of bread took them all day to eat. So I don't know what's going on there. Anyway, they have a feast. And he's just very hospitable. He's very generous. Now you might wonder, why are we given about 7 verses describing all that? It shows what hospitality should look like. So we'll understand, by contrast, at least part of what's wrong in Gibeah. And so they started out from Benjamin, south of what will become Jerusalem. Now it's still Gibeah. They start out in the afternoon because he kept them at least through the morning. And as they get to Gibeah, the sun is starting to go down, and the servant says, let's go to Gibeah. Still a Canaanite city in verse 11, but the Levite refuses to go there. They're foreigners, he calls them in verse 12. They do not belong to the people of Israel. He's expecting more hospitality and welcoming and protection from fellow Israelites. Who knows? He's probably also thinking, who knows what kind of horrible things could happen to us in a Canaanite city. And so they press on to Gibeah, or Gibeah. By getting the sun is starting to go down, they go on a little further to Gibeah. And now it's getting dark, and they go into the town square. And then is the first sign of trouble. No one asks them to stay with them. No one invites them in to their house. Decent people in their culture were expected to show hospitality to traveling strangers. Take them in, give them protection and a meal. There's few, if any, hotels in those days. And so travelers depended on the kindness of strangers. But for some reason, the people of Gibeah don't show any kindness. One old man, however, does see them, and he offers them hospitality in verse 16. But he's not from Gibeah. He's from Ephraim. And he's just staying there temporarily. He sees the Levite, and he asks, where are you going? Where are you from? In verse 17, the Levite answers and notes in verse 18, no one has taken me into his house. He's kind of amazed at this. Why are these people so inhospitable? He's struck by the lack of hospitality, and he emphasizes that he has all the provisions he needs. Notice that. I have plenty of hay, I have plenty of food for my donkey and our own. In other words, he's saying, I'll be no burden to you. And so the old man invites him to stay with him, stressing in verse 20, only, the old man says, only do not spend the night in the square. He knows this town pretty well. Now, at this point, the story has begun to sound very similar to the story in Genesis 19, where two men, who really turn out to be angels, come to Sodom, and they don't find any hospitality there either from the residents. They find only some from a foreigner in the town, Abraham's nephew Lot. The similarities don't stop there. In fact, the author who's writing Judges is intentionally, by the words he chooses, making us recall that story from Genesis. Just like in Genesis 19, they feast and are enjoying their meal together when the house is surrounded by men from the city. Here in verse 22, he calls those men worthless fellows, literally sons of Belial. In both Genesis 19 and Judges 19, the men demand that the travelers be brought out so that, same phrase in both chapters, we may know them. That term often used in the Old Testament for sex. They were demanding to have homosexual sex with the travelers, and that's the perversity. In both cases, the host, Lot in Genesis, the Ephraimite man here, they go out to the crowd to beg them not to, using the same word in both chapters, not to act wickedly or do this vile thing. It's actually translated differently in the ESV, but it's the same word in Hebrew. And in both cases, the perverse crowd will not listen, and in both cases tries to pound down the door to get in the house. In both cases, the host offer their women instead. Here in Judges, the Levite man grabs his concubine and throws her out to the crowd of perverts. And that too is perverse. Husbands are supposed to love their wives and give themselves up for them, not give them up for their own skins. The Levite shows his own perversity. The sins here are all perverse. That is meaning unnatural. It's opposite of the way that God has designed things in every way. It's a violation of hospitality. The townspeople should be offering the Levite safety, and instead of they attack him, homosexuality is perverse. Now, some people try to claim that the Bible doesn't condemn homosexuality, that the sin here and in Genesis 19 is merely a lack of hospitality. They are perverse. They are trying to twist Scripture to make it not say what it clearly does. Homosexuality is the acting wickedly, the vile thing that the host in both chapters denounce. Would it be sinful if there were no violation of the travelers? See, the way we read this, we tend to focus on the violation of their bodily autonomy, of their freedom to do what they wanted. Would it be sinful if there was no violation of the travelers? If in both Genesis 19 and Judges 19, if the travelers, the men of the city came and kind of proposed, made a proposal, and the travelers wanted to engage in homosexuality, would it still be sinful then with no violation of rights? Yes. It would still be wicked and vile and perverse because it's unnatural. We don't understand that in our sensate culture because we think the only sin really is violating someone's free choice. And if you're not violating anyone's free choice, then what you do is no one else's business. That's the way we kind of taught to think now. And so we see the Levite sin is violating his wife second class, if there is such a thing, by handing her over to the rapist against her will. And that is perverse. Don't misunderstand me. That is what he did. It was perverse. Violating her rights was perverse. But we miss the Levite's perversity that he should be willing to fight and if necessary lay down his own life for his wife. And no, there aren't any second-class wives, either a wife or not. There's perversity all around here. Our sensate culture only sees the violation of rights, not the failure to fulfill responsibilities. The Levite husband is perverse because he doesn't fulfill his responsibilities, not just because he violated the concubine's rights. Now, both are true, but not just because he violated her rights. The crowd of men from Gibeah is perverse, not just because they violated rights. That is wrong, of course, the Levite's right to bodily autonomy. But they're also perverse because what they want to do is unnatural, whether or not he consents. The sensate culture says the ultimate value is fulfilling sensual desires. And if no one's rights are violated, nothing is wrong. The ideational culture says The ultimate value is a supersensory, a beyond our senses God who has said this is vile, whether or not people consent. So the concubine is abused all night. Only as the dawn begins to break, they let her go, it says in verse 25. And then as morning appeared, she staggered back to the house that her perverse husband sheltered in, fell down at the entrance with her hands stretched out on the threshold. She was either dead already or she died of her wounds on the donkey ride back home. Her husband comes out and shows everyone, how much of a total jerk he is. No wonder she ran away from him. Seeing her lying there, he says in verse 28, not kind words, but get up, let us be going. Cold, callous. He's the sensate man who all he cares about is his own feelings. He takes her body away, and when he gets back home, he cuts it up into 12 pieces, sending a mushy, bloody, stinking package to each of the 12 tribes. In verse 29, everyone who saw it couldn't believe it. He said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt until this day. In verse 30. Now they had heard about this kind of thing in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom was the archetype of corruption and perversity. You couldn't get any lower than Sodom. And now a town in Israel has gotten that low. Consider it. Think about what it means that we've sunk this far. Take counsel, he says. Discuss what to do before God does to us what he did to Sodom. And speak. Pronounce a decision about this perversity. How low can you go? In chapter 20, they consider, they take counsel, and they act. And the result is a catastrophe. Well, first they consider the mushy, bloody, stinking packages distributed throughout all Israel. They got a lot of attention. Men from all over Israel, it says from Dan to Beersheba. There's that phrase, remember, from last week. Including people from Gilead, east of the Jordan River. So from all over Israel, they assembled to the Lord. So they're seeking the Lord's will, it says in verse 1 in chapter 20. They gather together their soldiers, their chief men from each tribe at a town called Mizpah. It's near Benjamin, very close to Gibeah. Despite the fact that a town in Israel has gotten as low as it could go, there is hope that the rest of Israel shows signs of moral health. They're outraged. Outrage is kind of like a gag reflex. You know, if you ever start to drink some spoiled milk, you didn't know it's spoiled, and you got to gag. That's because you're healthy, and your body is saying, no, we're not going to allow this in. Outrage is like that. It's like that this is perverse. We're not allowing this in to us. The one good thing in these chapters, the one good thing perhaps in these 3 chapters, is that Israel is outraged by what happened in Gibeah. Assembled together, they ask the Levite what happened. He tells a condensed version of the story. He conveniently leaves out that he threw the concubine out to the crowd to save his own skin. He just says in verse 5, they meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and she is dead. Kind of passes over the facts that don't make him look so good. He concludes in verse 6, they have done evil and a vile thing. Same word, that vile thing is the same word that old Ephraimite man used to the mob in Gibeah when he told them, don't do this vile thing. Same word Lot used to the men of Sodom, don't do this vile thing. And so they consider as one man in verse 8, meaning that they were united, they were agreed. They agreed that they're not going to go home. They're going to act immediately. First, they'll send out 10% of their men to go out and get provisions for the war. They're getting stocked up if necessary, if a long war. And then at the end of verse 10, they will repay Gibeah, Benjamin, for all the outrage. There's that word again. Translated as vile thing when the old Ephraimite man says it to the mob. Here, the outrage that they have committed in Israel. So they're all outraged, as they should be. And they're united against this one town, Gibeah. Now, all of them except Benjamin. Benjamin got their mushy, bloody, stinking package, and they weren't outraged. Maybe they know what's kind of been going on in Gibeah all this time. And they've been putting up with it. Maybe a generation or two earlier they were outraged, but they've gotten used to it by now. They've declined. They didn't come to the meeting at Mizpah. And so the rest of Israel sent representatives throughout Benjamin, calling them to join the rest of Israel in their outrage and to help them join with us. They say to purge evil from Israel. Notice first that Israel wanted only a surgical removal of this moral cancer of the worthless fellows in Gibeah. They were not looking for a civil war. They appeal in verse 13, give up the men, the worthless fellows in Gibeah. That's all. Give them up, that we may put them to death and purge evil from Israel. So they're right to be outraged. They're wise to be focused only on the worthless fellows of Gibeah. They're not overreacting yet. But for Benjamin, blood was thicker than covenant. They respond with tribalism. My tribe, my people, my race, or my country, or my state, whether it is right or wrong, standing by it. It's like the slogan some think is patriotic. My country, right or wrong. Well, it may be your country, whether it's right or wrong, but whether you support it, whether you fight for it, should depend on whether it is right or wrong. It's not like many Southerners in the Civil War, many white Southerners in the Civil War who thought, many of them they were thinking, I don't support slavery personally. I don't agree with it. I don't like slavery. But it's my country, which they thought was their state, my country, North Carolina, or my country, Virginia, right or wrong. I'll choose to fight for it. And so they chose to fight for their state. James Fenimore Cooper, at about that time, decried, quote, the patriotism which shouts our country, right or wrong, regardless alike of God and his eternal laws. But the Benjamite said, my tribe, right or wrong. Now, sure, the punks of Gibeah shouldn't have done that. But who are these other Israelites to tell us what we can do with our town? It's like the parent who thinks his little darling, okay, shouldn't have shouted profanities at the teacher, but he'll get angry at the teacher or the principal or the coach that disciplines that brat. My child, right or wrong. Benjamin responds with tribalism and so ends up fighting for Gibeah. That's the cause of the catastrophe. So Benjamin got his troops out alongside Gibeah, including a regiment. In chapter 20 describes I think it's 600 men, are left-handed slingshotters. Left-handed gives them a little advantage, I guess, over right-handed men. It says they could hit a hair. Such good shots. Benjamin may be outnumbered, but they're apparently better fighters. So the surgical strike, what they hoped was just a surgical strike against the worthless fellows of Gibeah, has turned out to be an all-out civil war. Now, Israel does the godly thing and seeks the Lord's guidance in nearby Bethel. They ask God in verse 18, who shall go up first to fight against the people of Benjamin? And the Lord tells them, Judah shall go up first. So notice, they seek the Lord's guidance, how to run this war. The Lord gives them instructions on how to prosecute this war, and they follow it. And a strange thing happens. Very strange. If you think that if you follow God, you follow God's word, you sought God's will, you do what he says, and the result will be immediate success. That success is the sign of having followed God's ways. We assume that God will lead us into victory, and nothing but victory. Just victory, blessings, growth, profit. But here Israel twice seeks the Lord's guidance for the battle. They're properly outraged at sin among God's people. They've wisely begun only dealing with the worthless fellows at Gibeah. They've done everything right up until now. They hear God's instructions. They follow them. They sought the Lord. They put it into practice. And the result is, twice, defeat. The first time Israel attacks Gibeah, following God's command, they lose 22,000 men in verse 21. Then, still outraged, they took courage. They encouraged themselves in verse 22, getting ready for another attack. First, they do the right thing and inquired of the Lord in verse 23. They're asking God, shall we again draw near to fight against our brothers, the people of Benjamin? Now notice, they're not acting on their own. They're not just kind of presumptuously assuming what they think is God's will, and then they find out that it's not because they've gone the wrong way. No, they're seeking God's will, and they are told, go up against them. They obey. The second time, they lose 18,000 men in verse 24. Now the question is, why did Israel lose twice following God's word? That's a difficult question. If you assume that following God will always result in immediate success, that if you get guidance from God, you follow it, then you will have success. You'll have victory and wealth and health right now. Well, that's what the sensate demand. The ultimate reality, the sensate think the ultimate reality is their comfort, their blessing, their success, their being wealthy or healthy. And the reason they follow God, the reason they go to church, the reason they read the Bible, the reason they pray, the reason they do all of that is to get that stuff, to get the money or the health, whatever the blessing they think is promised. And if you're a sensate person, you can believe in God, but you'll believe in a therapeutic God, a God who exists to give you that success, that money, that healing, that happiness, those good feelings right now. He certainly doesn't exist to twice lead you into a catastrophe. For the third time, Israel seeks the Lord about whether to go to battle against Benjamin. This time in verse 28, not only are they told to do it, but promised, I will give them into your hand. Notice that their success depends on God giving it to them. I'll give it into your hands. Victory is in his hands. Our obedience, that is our outrage at sin, our willingness to do church discipline, to follow his word, do what he says, that should be taken for granted. We should do that whether or not we are promised success for it. Whether or not we succeed or not depends on God giving it to us. Well, here God gives them success, and he does it through strategy. Now, some people would think, well, God's promised us success, so we're just going to go out there, not going to worry about anything. We want to march in order. We're just going to go out there and have our success. No, God promises them success, and they come up with a strategy. They apply themselves. They think. They plot an ambush, like Joshua did against Ai, drawing out the Benjamites from Gibeah with a feigned attack that they kind of retreat from, and that draws them out of the city as a distraction for 10,000 men to attack Gibeah from the other direction, and they set it on fire, and they'll have the Benjamite soldiers then caught in between them, the two Israelite armies. Benjamite soldiers will now know that they're defeated because they'll look back and their city's on fire, the one they've been fighting for, and so they'll be discouraged and they'll run away and they'll get caught. And Israel then kills Benjamin's troops, who are twice, by the way. Benjamin's troops are twice in verses 44 and 46 called men of valor. It means they're noblemen. They're men of courage, of skill, who have trained themselves for battle. They're self-disciplined men who taught themselves to be good soldiers. But they applied their skills and their character and their virtues in support of evil. Kind of like the brave, selfless, skilled, hardworking German soldiers of World War II. Many of them didn't hate Jews. They didn't join the Nazi Party. They didn't vote for Hitler. But they applied themselves to support that evil. Here, the men of valor from Benjamin did that. And they were killed for fighting for evil. The rest of the chapter from verses 29 to 46 tells the story of this ambush, but says Israel finally wins because, in verse 35, the Lord defeated Benjamin. But Israel made one mistake. In the fury and the frenzy of war, when that bloodlust started boiling, they didn't know when to stop. In the 1991 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, the battle for Kuwait, turned into one of the most lopsided wars in all of history. There were very few American casualties, but the U.S. was just obliterating the Iraqi army. And as the Iraqis were trying to flee from Kuwait City, they're fleeing out the highway back toward Iraq, the U.S. Air Forces caught them out in the open on the highway in cars and trucks and just slaughtered them, creating what they called the highway of death. The destruction was so total, there was nothing between the U.S. Army in Kuwait and Baghdad up in Iraq. But President George H.W. Bush said, "I want the killing to stop." And so it did. The men in charge of Israel, and what began as a surgical strike, what they wanted to be a surgical strike to punish the worthless fellows at Gibeah for their perversity, the men in charge forgot to say, when Gibeah went up in smoke, Benjamin's troops were on the run, they forgot to say, "We want the killing to stop." The result was a catastrophe. How low can you go? Your holy outrage can lead to too much destruction, leaving you with a quandary. They've nearly wiped out the whole tribe of Benjamin, only leaving 600 men. No women left, no families left, just the 600 men. They vowed, they tell us in chapter 21, verse 1, to never give their daughters in marriage to any man from Benjamin. Why did they vow that for? God never told them to do that. It made no sense. It's one of these kind of things you do when the hatred starts just churning in you. And they weren't thinking clearly. So Israel has lost a whole tribe. In verse 2, they meet before God and they wail and they wept bitterly when they realize what they've done by going too far. They say, "Oh Lord, the God of Israel, why has this happened in Israel? Why this catastrophe?" Of course, the answer is because you got carried away. You didn't have to wipe out all Benjamin. You didn't have to treat them like they were Canaanites, and you shouldn't have made that foolish vow. But this is a book of Judges, remember? Other vows in Judges, like Jephthah, who vowed to sacrifice whoever came out of his house first. What a crazy thing to do. And they believed they had to keep their vows. People today would just say, people would say, "Well, never mind, take it back." Do you know why we now so easily break our commitments? And we kind of look at them and then we think their belief that they're bound to their vows to keep their word, we look at that and we think that's kind of weird. You know why we're that way? Because we've declined. We in this culture don't have any sense that there's something beyond our feelings or our convenience that binds us. We make a commitment and it's no longer convenient. We'll say, never mind. Something that's greater than us, someone who's greater than us, who will hold us to account for broken vows. In our sensate culture, the ultimate value is our feelings, our convenience. In the ideational culture, it was God who hears our words. We've gone lower than them. Now the quandary is that they must restore Benjamin to make Israel whole without breaking their vow. They have no Benjamite women left, and they're bound to their vow not to give them any of their relatives as wives. And so the first thing they do, they take attendance, and they see that there was one Israelite city, Jabesh Gilead, it's just east of the Jordan River, that didn't send any troops to their crusade. And they think if they're not for us, they're against us. And so they send out 12,000 troops to wipe them all out, devoting them to destruction in verse 11, like they're Canaanites, leaving only their girls, whom they give to the remaining Benjamite men. They present these women, they're called women in chapter 21, verse 14. They're probably mostly teenage girls. To the Benjamite men, they give them to them as tokens of peace. In verse 13 and verse 15, Israel had compassion on Benjamin because the Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Notice that statement. The Lord had made a breach in the tribes of Israel. Notice that even though the breach really is the result of their excesses, of their bloodlust, of their foolish vow, still they recognize the Lord did it. It was under God's control. The Lord had made a breach. Everything is under God's control. Even our sins, even our foolish vows, even the catastrophes that we cause. But we're still responsible for our sins. The quandary. How are we going to make Israel whole? They only get 400 girls for the 600 Benjamite men. So they need 200 more. And they stated as an absolute law in verse 17, chapter 21, verse 17, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe not be blotted out of Israel. There must be. But they can't break their word. Their word is their bond. So Israel agrees that the 200 Benjamite single men left over, that they can go to this feast in nearby Shiloh. You know, the one that the girls like to come out of dancing? They can go to that one. And then, you grab a girl and she's yours. It's an easy way. No online dating app. And since this was agreed on in mass, in public, I imagine that the girls, at least some of them, or at least their fathers, at least some of them, knew about it. That way they can provide wives for the rest of Benjamin and restore that tribe to Israel without breaking their word. And they did. How low can you go? You can go this low. When in that last verse, there is no king in Israel, and everyone does what is right in his own sensate eyes. It all sounds like a mess, though, doesn't it? In this whole long story. There's no truly good guys, no white hats. There's no pure models that you want to follow. There's no wise sages you want to listen to and heed. There was plenty of perversity, tribalism causing a catastrophe and a quandary on how to restore Israel. There was no perfect king of Israel from Bethlehem who was outraged at sin and his holy people, purging Israel, but ordering when the killing should stop. No Prince of Peace, no wonderful counselor. Now we may have declined, but we have no excuse for going back to be as low or lower than them, because we have a king. For unto us the Son was given, and the government is on his shoulders. Jesus the King was born and now reigns. He declared, all authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. The question then, do you see him as the only true reality and value? Are you seeking his reign over you and seeking it first?